The runway lights came on at 11:47 p.m., and I was the only person in the county who knew they weren't supposed to. I've worked for the Lindle County Public Works Department for 19 years. Most of that time has been spent doing exactly what you'd expect: patching roads, replacing culverts, keeping the salt sheds stocked before winter, signing off on contractor invoices for things nobody outside the department will ever think about. It's not interesting work, and that's the point. People don't notice public works unless something has gone wrong. When we do our jobs right, we are invisible. About 6 years ago, I was moved into a position called Facilities Liaison. That's a generous title for what's really a paperwork job. I'm the person who maintains the master inventory of every county-owned structure that isn't currently in active municipal use. Old fire halls, the closed elementary school out on Route 12, 2 water towers we kept standing because demolition cost more than letting them rust, a grain elevator the county took possession of after a tax dispute in 2003. There are 47 of these properties on my list. I inspect them on a rotating schedule, fill out a 1-page condition report, and file the reports in a binder that gets reviewed by my supervisor once a year, if that. The 47th property on my list is the airport. It isn't really an airport, not the way you're picturing. Lindle Regional was built in 1962, with federal money during a period when small towns across the Midwest were promised that air travel would revitalize them. It has a single asphalt runway, 8,000 feet long, oriented roughly north-northeast to south-southwest. There is one terminal building, single-story, brick, about the size of a large bank branch. There's a small control tower attached to the terminal that hasn't been staffed since 1989. There are 4 hangars, 2 of which collapsed in a windstorm in the early 90s and were never rebuilt. There is a fuel farm with 2 above-ground tanks that have been empty since the Carter administration, and there is a perimeter fence that has not been continuous in 20 years. The airport stopped scheduled passenger service in 1978. It continued to handle some private aviation traffic, mostly crop dusters and a few hobby pilots, until 1994, when the FAA pulled its operating certificate during a routine inspection. After that, it became county property, and it became mine. My job at the airport is simple. I drive out twice a year, in May and in October, and I walk the property. I check the terminal doors are locked. I check the fence where it still exists. I note any vandalism. I photograph any new graffiti. I filed the report. In 19 years, the most exciting thing I've ever written in an airport report was raccoon nest in the southeast corner of terminal lobby. Animal control notified. That changed last October. I want to say up front that I am not a person who believes in much. I was raised Methodist, lapsed in my 20s, and never really came back to it. I don't read horoscopes. I don't watch shows about hauntings. My wife, Pat, watches those programs sometimes, and I'll sit in the room with her. But I do crosswords during them. I'm telling you this because what I'm about to describe is not the kind of thing I would have given any weight to if it had happened to someone else. I would have assumed they were drunk, or lying, or looking for attention. I have to ask you to extend me the courtesy I would not have extended to them. The October inspection started normally. I drove out on a Tuesday morning, October 14th. The weather was clear, cool, no wind to speak of. I parked at the main gate, which is chained but not locked because the chain is for show. The gate post on the right side is rotted through, and you can lift the whole assembly out of the ground if you want to. I walked the runway first, which is my habit. It takes about 40 minutes to walk the full length and back, and it gives me time to look for the kind of damage that matters. Frost heaves, cracking, vegetation pushing up through the seams. I noted 3 new cracks in the surface near the south end, which I would have to mention but which were not urgent. I walked back to the terminal. The terminal has 2 exterior doors. The main passenger entrance, which faces the parking lot, and a service door on the north side that opens into what used to be the baggage handling area. Both doors have padlocks. The keys are on a ring in my office, and the ring has a faded paper tag on it that says LRA in pencil. I unlocked the main entrance and went inside. The interior of the terminal is what you would expect. Linoleum floor with a pattern of cream and brown squares, peeled up in several places. A long counter where the single ticket agent used to work, with a rotary phone still bolted to the wall behind it. 8 rows of metal-framed chairs with vinyl cushions, most of the cushions split open and the foam gone yellow. A vending machine that has been empty since at least the 1980s. A drinking fountain. A sign over the door to the tarmac that says Gate 1, even though there was never a Gate 2. I did my walkthrough. I checked the restrooms, both of which still smell faintly of old urinal cake, even though the plumbing has been dry for decades. I checked the door to the control tower stairs, which is locked separately, and which I do not have a key for. That lock is the FAA's responsibility, and they have not visited the property since 1994. I checked the door to the back office where the airport manager used to work. That door was locked, as always. I checked the door to what used to be the baggage area, and I unlocked it and went through. And that is where I found the first thing that was wrong. On the floor of the baggage area, near the conveyor belt that hasn't moved in 45 years, there was a suitcase. It was a hard-sided suitcase, the old kind with metal corners and a flip-clasp closure. It was the color of dried mustard. It was sitting upright on its wheels, with the handle extended, as if someone had set it down for a moment and walked away. There was no dust on it. The floor around it had dust on it. The suitcase did not. I stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time. My first thought was that someone had broken in and left it there as a joke. Teenagers, maybe. We get teenagers out at the airport sometimes, drinking, doing what teenagers do. But the door to the baggage area had been locked, and so had the main entrance, and the windows in this part of the building are covered with plywood from the inside. There was no way for a person to have placed that suitcase where it was sitting, and then left without leaving any sign of entry. I walked over to it. I did not touch it. I crouched down and looked at the tag attached to the handle. The tag was paper, the old kind, with a string loop, the kind airlines used in the 70s. There was handwriting on it in blue ballpoint. The handwriting said, Glenn H. Wyler, Seat 14C, LRAMSPSEAFLT 209. I read that tag 4 times. My name is Glenn Wyler. The middle initial is H for Howard, after my grandfather. I have never owned a hard-sided yellow suitcase in my life. I have never flown out of Lindle Regional Airport, because Lindle Regional Airport stopped flying passengers 2 years before I was born. I have, in my entire life, flown on a commercial aircraft exactly 6 times, and never to Seattle. I stood up. I backed out of the baggage area. I closed the door behind me and locked it. I walked out of the terminal, locked the main entrance, got in my truck, and drove back to the office. I did not file a report that day. I told my supervisor, Donna, that I'd had a flat tire halfway through and would need to go back the following week to finish. She didn't care. She never cares. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Pat and tried to come up with explanations. The most reasonable one I could construct was that someone, a former employee maybe, or a relative of one, had broken in, placed the suitcase as some kind of prank or memorial, and left through a route I hadn't identified. The tag with my name was harder to explain, but I made myself believe that Wyler is not an uncommon name in this part of the state, that there might have been a Glenn Wyler who had flown out of Lindle in 1976, and that this was a coincidence I was inflating because I was tired and the building was creepy. By morning, I had almost convinced myself. I went back to the airport the following Tuesday, October 21st. I told Donna I'd remembered I needed to recheck the south end of the runway. She waved me out of the office without looking up. When I got to the terminal, the main door was still locked. I went inside. I went straight to the baggage area. I unlocked that door. The suitcase was still there, in the same position, still without dust on it. But now, there was a second one beside it. The second suitcase was a soft-sided garment bag, black, with a luggage tag in the same handwriting as before. I made myself read this one too. The name on it was Marisol Tevin, Seat 9A, LRA to MSP to SEA, Flight 209. I did not recognize the name Marisol Tevin. I made a note of it in my pocket notebook, in pencil, and I left. When I got home that evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and looked the name up. There are not many Marisol Tevins on the internet. The first result was an obituary from the Lindle Sentinel Standard, dated April 8, 1974. Marisol Tevin, age 31, of Lindle, died in a single-vehicle accident on County Road 9 when her car left the road during a rainstorm. She was survived by her husband Daniel and a daughter, age 4. The obituary said she had been on her way to the airport. I closed the laptop and sat for a long time. Pat asked me if I was all right. I told her I was tired. She asked me what I'd been looking up. I told her it was a property records question for work. I have not lied to my wife more than a handful of times in our marriage. That was one of them. The next morning I went into the office early, before Donna got in, and I went to the basement. The basement of the Public Works building is where we keep everything that isn't current. Old binders, old maps, old correspondence, old contracts. Most of it should have been digitized years ago, and most of it never will be. The lighting down there is fluorescent, and 2 of the 4 tubes in the main bay are dead, so you work in a kind of greenish dim. There are metal shelves running the length of the room, and the shelves are labeled by decade and category. I went to the shelves marked Aviation, and I started pulling binders. It took me about 2 hours to find what I was looking for. The binder was labeled LRA Operations, 1970 to 1978. Inside it, among the fuel logs and the maintenance schedules and the carbon copies of FAA correspondence, there was a section of flight manifests. Lindle Regional, during its commercial period, was served by a small regional carrier called Northstar Commuter. Northstar ran 2 flights a day out of Lindle, both routed through Minneapolis-St. Paul. One was a morning flight, designated Flight 104. The other was an afternoon flight, designated Flight 209. I went through the manifests for Flight 209. They were carbon copies, faded, and they were organized by date. I found April 8, 1974. The manifest for Flight 209 on that date listed 22 passengers. Seat 9A was assigned to Marisol Tevin. I let my finger move down the column. Seat 14C was empty. The space where the passenger name should have been was blank. I went back through the binder. I found the manifests for the entire week of April 8th. I cross-referenced. The flight had departed Lindle that afternoon at 2:14 p.m. on schedule, with 22 passengers and 3 crew. It landed at MSP at 3:48 p.m. There was no incident. The manifest from the following day showed Flight 209 had departed again on schedule, with a different passenger list. There was nothing in the binder about Marisol Tevin not boarding. There was nothing about her death. As far as Northstar Commuter's records were concerned, she had simply not been on the flight she had a ticket for, and the airline had moved on. I sat in that basement for a long time, with the binder open on my lap, looking at the blank space next to seat 14, C. I want to tell you that I went home that night and told my wife everything, and we decided together that I should hand the file to my supervisor and walk away. I want to tell you that. But you and I both know that isn't what I did. What I did was, I went back to the airport. I went back on a Thursday, in the late afternoon, with a flashlight and my pocket notebook and a thermos of coffee. I told Pat I was going to a meeting at the county building. I parked at the main gate, lifted the post, drove through and put the post back. I parked behind the terminal where my truck couldn't be seen from the access road. I unlocked the main door. I went in. There were now 4 suitcases in the baggage area, the 2 I had already seen and 2 new ones. A canvas duffel bag tagged for seat 6B, name Albert Pinochev. A child's small vinyl case with a cartoon astronaut on the side, tagged for seat 11F, name Christine Pinochev. Both routed LRA to MSP to SEA, both Flight 209. I wrote the names down. I did not look them up that night. I think I already knew what I was going to find. I went home. I lay in bed. I did not sleep. The next morning I went back to the basement. I pulled the Sentinel Standard archives, which are on microfiche, in a cabinet that hasn't been opened in a decade, and which I had to clean the reader for before I could use it. I looked up Pinochev. I found Albert and Christine Pinochev in the obituaries of November 12, 1976. House fire on Clement Street, father and daughter, ages 34 and 6. The mother, Helen, had been at work at the hospital and had survived. The article noted that the family had been planning a move to Washington State and had been in the process of selling their home. I went back to the binder. November 12, 1976. Flight 209, seat 6B blank, seat 11F blank. I started a list. Over the next 3 weeks, I went to the airport 11 times. I went after work on weekends, once at 4 in the morning. Each time I went, there were more suitcases. By the second week of November, there were 31 of them, arranged in neat rows on the baggage area floor, as if waiting to be loaded. I documented each one. I wrote down the name on each tag. I cross-referenced each name against the Sentinel Standard obituaries and against the Flight 209 manifests. Every single one matched. Every name on every tag belonged to a person who had died in Lindle County between 1974 and the present day, on a date when Flight 209 had operated as scheduled, and whose seat number on that flight had been left blank on the original manifest. Some of the names I recognized. Donna Halverson, who had been the manager of the Lindle hardware store and who had died of cancer in 2008, was tagged for seat 4A on a flight in March of that year. Reverend Calvin Astor, who had baptized my daughter, was tagged for seat 17D on a flight in October 2011. A boy named Tyler Mosk, who had been in the same fourth grade class as my son and who had drowned in the reservoir during the summer of 1997, was tagged for seat 22B on a flight from that July. His suitcase was a small backpack with a Power Rangers logo on the front. I sat on the floor of that baggage area with 31 tagged bags around me, and I tried to work out what I was looking at. The best I could come up with was this. There was a flight, and the flight had always had open seats, and the open seats had always belonged to people who had not made it to the airport. And somewhere, on some schedule I could not see, the airline was still trying to fill the manifest. The yellow suitcase with my name on it was still there. Still no dust. It had been there for over a month. I want to tell you about the rule. I found the rule on November 18th, in a place I had not thought to look. In the old airport manager's office, which I had never been inside, because the key for it was not on my ring. I had passed that locked door dozens of times over the years and accepted that it was not my business. But that afternoon, with 31 suitcases on the floor in the next room and my own name on one of them, I decided it was my business now. I broke the lock with a pry bar from my truck. It took about 10 minutes. The frame was old soft pine, and the bolt was rusted, and the whole thing came apart with less effort than I expected. The office was small, a desk, a filing cabinet, a metal chair, a calendar on the wall still flipped to August 1989. There was a coffee cup on the desk with something dried in the bottom of it. There was a Rolodex. There was an in-tray with one piece of paper in it. The paper was a typed memo, dated June 3, 1978, from a person identified only as the FAA Regional Operations Liaison. It was addressed to the airport manager. The subject line read, Decommissioning Checklist LRA. The memo was 3 paragraphs long. The first 2 were about the procedural requirements for closing the airport to scheduled passenger traffic. The third paragraph, which I read 4 times, said this. Per standing arrangement with Northstar Commuter Operations, the final scheduled Flight 209 departing LRA on June 30th will be permitted to maintain its assigned manifest until such time as all originally ticketed seats are confirmed occupied. Facility lighting and approach systems are to remain operational at scheduled departure intervals until completion. Local liaison required for the duration. Successor liaison to be designated in writing prior to retirement of current. I read that paragraph until I could recite it. Then I went to the filing cabinet. The top drawer was empty. The middle drawer was empty. The bottom drawer was not. In the bottom drawer there was a single manila folder. Inside the folder there was a list. The list was a column of names, handwritten in pencil, going down a sheet of yellow legal paper. There were 8 names on the list. The first name was dated 1978 and identified as Russell Carmody, who I knew had been the airport manager when the airport closed and who I knew had died in his sleep in 1991. The second name was dated 1991 and identified as Margaret Pell, who I did not recognize but who I would later learn had worked in records for the county until 2003. The third name was dated 2003 and identified as Howard Linnett, who had been my predecessor in the facilities liaison position and who had died of a stroke 6 months after I took over the job. The fourth name on the list was mine. It was dated 2006, which was the year I had taken over Howard's position. The handwriting was not mine. I had never seen this piece of paper before in my life. The 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th lines were blank. I sat in the airport manager's chair, in an office that had been locked since 1989, holding a piece of paper that proved someone had assigned me a job I'd never been told about. Outside, through the dirty window, the runway stretched away into the dusk. The windsock at the south end was still hanging from its pole. It moved a little in the breeze. The terminal PA system clicked on. I want to be precise about this. The terminal at Lindle Regional has a PA system, an old one, ceiling speakers throughout the building wired to a single console behind the ticket counter. It has not been powered in decades. It is not connected to anything that could give it power. I had verified this years ago, the first time I'd done my inspection, because I wanted to know whether I needed to budget for its removal. The wiring is intact, the speakers are intact, but the system has no power source. The PA system clicked on, and a woman's voice, calm, professional, a voice from another era said, "Northstar Commuter Flight 209, service to Minneapolis-St. Paul with continuing service to Seattle, is now boarding at Gate 1. All ticketed passengers please proceed to the gate. Final boarding call." There was a pause. "Mr. Glenn H. Wyler, please proceed to Gate 1. Mr. Glenn Wyler, your flight is now boarding." I did not move. I sat in that chair, and I did not move for a long time. The PA system clicked off. The building was quiet again. I could hear my own breathing. I left the airport. I drove home. I did not tell my wife. The next morning, I went to the basement of the Public Works building, and I read the memo again. I read it a dozen times. The phrase that I kept coming back to was, "until such time as all originally ticketed seats are confirmed occupied." I went back to the binder. I counted the manifests. Flight 209 had operated in its commercial run on something close to a daily basis from 1962 to 1978. I did the rough math. Tens of thousands of departures. If each one had even one empty seat, and most flights in those years had several, then the number of seats that had never been confirmed occupied was, conservatively, in the tens of thousands. I understood then that what I had been calling a job was not a job. It was a post. And the post had an expected duration. And the duration was not something the people who had assigned it to me were planning to define. I want to tell you about Howard. Howard Linnett was my predecessor. I worked under him for 2 years before he retired, and the position came to me. He was a quiet man, in his 60s, who never married, and who lived alone in a small house on the east edge of town. He taught me the inspection rotation, and he walked me through the binder system, and he was patient with my questions. But there were certain things he never explained. He never explained why the airport was on the list. He never explained why the inspection keyring had a paper tag with the letters LRA on it, instead of a printed label like the other properties. He never explained why, when we drove out together for my orientation visit, he had walked me around the entire property, but had not taken me inside the terminal. He had unlocked the door, looked in, and locked it again. He had said, "Nothing to see in there, just chairs." He retired in 2006. He had a stroke 6 months later and died in the hospital. I went to the funeral. There were maybe a dozen people there. After I found the list with my name on it, I drove out to the cemetery where Howard is buried. I do not know why I did this. I think I wanted to ask him something, in the way that you sometimes want to ask the dead something even though you know better. His grave is in the back of the Lutheran Cemetery on Coldwater Road, a simple marker, his name and his dates. I stood in front of it for a while. There was a small object resting on top of the headstone. It was a luggage tag, paper with a string loop, blue ballpoint handwriting. It said, "Howard R. Linnett Seat 3, BLRAMSPSEAFLT 209. The string was new. The paper was not weathered. Someone had placed it there recently. I picked it up. I turned it over. On the back, in the same handwriting, there was one more line. It said, "Confirmed occupied. April 12th, 2007. April 12th, 2007 was the date Howard Linnett had died. I put the tag back on the headstone. I drove home. I sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time before I went inside. That was 3 weeks ago. I have been back to the airport twice since then. Both times, the suitcases are still there. The count is now 34. 3 new ones have appeared since the night the PA system spoke my name. I have not looked at the tags on the new ones. I do not want to know whose they are. I am afraid that if I look, I will recognize them, and I am more afraid that I will not. I have started to notice things in my regular life that I did not notice before. The arrival and departure board in the lobby of the county building, which has been broken for years and shows only a scrolling line of dashes, Occasionally shows a row of text now when I walk past it. It is always the same text. FLT 209. Boarding Gate 1. It is only there for a second or two, and only when I am alone in the lobby, and I have not been able to photograph it. The phone in my office rang last Tuesday at 2:14 p.m. When I picked it up, there was no one on the line, but there was a sound in the background that I recognized after a moment as the sound of a propeller aircraft idling on a tarmac. It rang again at 2:14 the next day, and the day after that. I stopped answering it at that time. Pat asked me last night what was wrong. She said I had been quiet for weeks. I told her I was thinking about retiring. She was surprised. I am only 56, and we had planned for me to work until 62. She asked me why. I told her I was tired of the job. She said, "Glenn, you don't even do anything. How can you be tired of it?" I did not have a good answer for her. I have thought about leaving. I have thought about putting in my notice, walking away from the facility's liaison position, and never going back to the airport. I have thought about it carefully. The problem is the list. The list has 4 names on it that have already been confirmed occupied, and 1 name mine that has not. There is no 5th name. The position has not been reassigned because I have not retired and I have not died. If I leave, I do not know what will happen. If I die, I know what happens. I have seen it on Howard's headstone. I went back out to the airport last night. I want to tell you what I saw, and then I want to be done with this. I drove out at 11:30 p.m. The weather was clear. There was no moon. I parked behind the terminal as I have been doing. I walked around the building to the runway side. I had not intended to go inside. At 11:47 p.m., the runway lights came on. They came on in sequence, starting from the south end and traveling north, the way they do at a functioning airport when an aircraft is on approach. Blue centerline lights, white edge lights, the red threshold markers at the far end. I had not known the runway lights still worked. I'm not sure they do, in any conventional sense. There's no electrical service to the airfield. The transformer was disconnected in 1995. I checked the documentation last week to be sure. The lights came on and they stayed on. The runway stretched out in front of me, lit, ready. I stood at the edge of the apron and I listened. I could hear it before I could see it. A small propeller engine, twin engine, the kind of sound a regional commuter aircraft makes on approach. It was coming from the south, from beyond the trees at the end of the runway. It got louder slowly. I could not see any landing lights in the sky. There was nothing visible above the runway. But the sound was there, and the sound was descending. The aircraft touched down at the south end of the runway at 11:53 p.m. I did not see it land. There was nothing to see, but I heard the tires touch the asphalt. I heard the reverse thrust on the engines. I heard it roll out along the lit runway, past me, toward the north end. I heard it slow. I heard it turn. I heard it taxi back toward the terminal. It stopped on the apron, about 40 feet from where I was standing. I could hear the engines spool down. I could hear, very faintly, the sound of a door opening somewhere in the air in front of me, and the soft, mechanical unfolding of air stairs. There was nothing there. The apron was empty. I was looking directly at the space where the aircraft should have been, and there was only the lit runway behind it and the dark field beyond. The terminal PA system clicked on. The woman's voice, calm and professional, said, "Northstar Commuter Flight 209, arriving from Seattle via Minneapolis-St. Paul, has landed at Lindle Regional. Passengers may deplane at Gate 1. Welcome home." There was a pause. "Ground personnel, please proceed to baggage claim for unloading. I want to tell you that I stood my ground. I want to tell you that I refused to move. I did not. I walked, without making the decision to walk, around the side of the terminal to the baggage area door. I unlocked it. I went inside. The 34 suitcases were gone. The floor of the baggage area was empty. The dust had been disturbed in long, dragging streaks, as if the bags had been pulled out through the closed door to the tarmac. The door to the tarmac was still locked. I checked. There was 1 suitcase left. The yellow, hard-sided suitcase with my name on it was sitting alone in the center of the floor. It was no longer upright on its wheels. The clasps were open. The lid was lifted just slightly, as if someone had begun to unpack it and been interrupted. I did not look inside it. I left the baggage area. I locked the door behind me. I walked out of the terminal and locked that door too. I got in my truck and I drove home. The runway lights were still on when I left. I watched them in the rearview mirror until the road curved, and I couldn't see them anymore. This morning, the runway lights were off. I drove out to check at first light. The terminal was locked, the way I had left it. The fence was the way it had been. There were no aircraft on the apron. There were no marks on the runway. Everything was the way it had always been, except that inside the baggage area, the yellow suitcase was now upright again, with its lid closed, sitting in the spot where I had first found it, with the dust around it undisturbed, and the dust on the suitcase itself absent. The tag on the handle had been updated. There was a new line of handwriting on the back. It said, "Arrived L.R.A. awaiting final confirmation." I'm writing this down because I want there to be a record. I do not know who will read it or when. I have not decided what to do with it. I have not told my wife. I have not told my supervisor. I have not told my children, who are grown and who live far away and who do not need to be worried about their father. The phone in my office still rings at 2:14. The arrival board in the lobby still flickers. The list in the bottom drawer of the airport manager's desk still has 4 blank lines under my name. I went out to the cemetery again yesterday afternoon. Howard's tag is still on his headstone. I noticed something I had not noticed before. There is a faint indentation in the grass beside his grave, about the size and shape of a person standing still, in the spot where a visitor would stand to read the marker. The grass has not grown back in that spot. I do not know how long it has been there. I did not stand on it. The runway lights came on again last night, at 11:47. I watched them from my kitchen window. You cannot see the airport from my house under normal conditions. It is 6 miles away, behind a low ridge. But I could see the glow last night, against the underside of the clouds, the way you can see the lights of a small town from a long way off if the sky is right. The glow lasted for about 20 minutes. Then it went out. I'm going to file my October inspection report tomorrow. I'm going to note that the property is secure and that no significant deterioration has been observed. I'm going to put the report in the binder. I'm going to go home. I am not going to retire. I have thought about it carefully, and I am not going to retire. I think that as long as I am still in the position, the post is staffed, and as long as the post is staffed, the manifest is still being worked. I do not know how many more names are supposed to go in those 4 blank lines below mine. I do not know if it would be 4, or 40, or 400. I do not know how long the airline has been working on this, or how long it is willing to wait. What I know is that there is a yellow suitcase in the baggage area of Lindle Regional Airport with my name on it. The tag on the suitcase says it arrived last night. The tag does not say it has departed. I think as long as it does not depart, I do not either. The runway lights came on again tonight, at 11:47 while I was writing this. They are still on.